Hello, welcome to another sound booth tutorial. I'm Daniel Jason Booth. Today we're going to look at how we can Tchad Blake your drums. So here's an example. It's just a very basic kit with kick, snare, hi-hats and a mono overhead. What I've done is I've got the hi-hats and the overhead feeding an overhead master track, aux track, and they are being squashed every time that the kick and the snare hit. Just a personal choice in that, and in terms of the panning, I've got 95% to the left and 11% just because this is a mono, and I just wanted it a bit more stereo, so that's kind of how I'm getting it there. And quite a bit of EQ action and different on both sides. Here's how it sounds without the Tchad Blake trick. Okay, kind of pillowy bass drum, mainly because of how I've EQ'd it, and it's kind of like a retro 70s sort of sounding kit. I didn't actually record this one, and there weren't that many microphones to choose from. There was a floor tom mic, which I'm not actually using. Here's how it sounds with some SansAmp on it. So that's coming from a send from both the kick and the snare. I've got it in pre-fader because I want to just listen to it isolated. So what I'll do is I'll rebuild these settings, but I want to talk a little bit about the philosophy behind this as much as I can understand it. Tchad Blake is a bit of an enigma, and what I love about his approach is that it completely disregards all the rules that we associate with audio. I mean, here we're running a parallel saturation track or a distortion track with SansAmp, and we've got flipped polarity and it's being blended back in. It's also being filtered out on the top and the bottom. It's not a very intuitive thing to kind of come up with that. And I've also got a gate on the back end so that it's not always in the mix. If we just remove it. So it's just there to tighten it up a little bit. For the moment, I'm going to get rid of that. Philosophically, it's not about being a great engineer or getting the most low end or anything like that. What I think Tchad is trying to do is he's opening up the possibility of tones that you can get from SansAmp or from anything like that. So that sounds really good, and you may like that sound, but you might like that sound too. It's more of a quest for tone shaping. Obviously, all of these sort of decisions you'll make in the context of an entire mix. So think of it like that. Think of it like you're basically shaping the tone of the drums using the distortion in parallel. And this whole part of it is about having a few more options of how to shape the tone of it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reset these, and I'll take these out, and we'll just have a bit of a play and see what we can come up with. That's kind of a retro Black Keys sort of crunchy, distorted, trashy sound that I'm kind of used to hearing in a lot of Tchad's mixes. It's because what he's doing is he's sending his kick and his snare to this saturation bus, blending that back in. This might sound too much in its current context. Put that in a mix and you won't notice it so much. What's really great about it is you can just use the saturation bus. And as a friend of mine, Chris Bellman, suggested, you can use it for a few bars just like an effects mic. So you don't even need an effects mic when you're recording the drums. You can just run it through SansAmp for a few bars and have that be like an alternate sound that you can feature before it breaks out into a big chorus or something. From what I understand and what I've seen Tchad talk about and read about in interviews, for him, clean sounds are not his thing. He just loves color, and this technique plays right into his philosophy of trying to extract as much out of the equipment that he's got, and he's very good at that. He's come about this technique because he's tried to put SansAmp in parallel with the drums before, and he's found that it doesn't work. And I've actually found this myself, so that's kind of how I draw the conclusion of why he would then put something like an EQ out of polarity with the original drums. But generally what happens is, because you've got the kick and the snare, they're panned center, and then you're sending them to this distortion unit. In this case, it's SansAmp, which is also panned center. What you're hearing is a combination of different phase interactions that are happening between a distorted signal and the original, which is clean. So to throw them 180 degrees out of phase, or flipping the polarity with the original sound, you're not actually cancelling the original sound. What you're doing is you're blending, and in this case filtering, the sound that is distorted and not an exact copy of the drums. So it really does, I find, open up a lot of tonal opportunities greater than what SansAmp alone can come up with. The other thing, of course, you can do is start out with the filters and the EQ already engaged, and then adjust SansAmp to taste. There's really no rules here. It's all about tone shaping. It's not about how much low end can I get, how much snap can I get. It's about creating different tones and sticking with that and never touching the level of this saturation track, because you then start to alter the phase relationships that are happening with the original kick and snare. And from there, these three tracks are actually forming the sound of the kick and snare. If you wanted to then change them, you wanted to add more low end, you wanted to add more top, you could do that by sending them all into the same bus. Or you can send everything except for these two tracks here, because they're already being bussed here. You could then send them into their own drum bus, or drum master as I've called it, and make any further adjustments to the sound. The other thing about this technique using the distortion unit, SansAmp, is that it actually makes it so that you don't have to use compression. I don't think I'm using any compression here, so that compressor's not being engaged. This one is engaged, but I'm just using it for tone, I think, and it's really not doing anything to change the sound there. But you can hear there's significant increase in volume, and it's almost like having a parallel compression track, but what it's doing in terms of adding tone to the drums, you could never do that with parallel compression. Well, let's not say never, but it would be unusual to have a compressor that could do all of this in the same process as what SansAmp's doing. So that's set back to Unity. So I'll have another play with this, and we'll see what I can get out of it by working with the EQ and the polarity flipped already. Already we're starting to get some cool tones. What I'm listening for when I'm adjusting this is just the overall tone of the kick and the snare. And to a certain extent, I'm also listening for phase relationships. You will hear when the snare feels a bit weaker or hollow, and same with the kick. It's a bit of a balancing act, but have a bit of a play with this technique. It's quite fun. I love what that's adding there in terms of punch. To me, it almost sounds like tape or something. Without it. I mean, you can hear there that it's kind of given it a big, fat, beefy, punchy sort of a tone. It's a nice sound, like there's nothing wrong with that sound. Maybe a bit of EQ or whatnot to brighten that up. Just the addition of the SansAmp with that EQ and the gate. Let's remove the gate. In this case, I'm just using the gate to control the length of the distortion, because if you go quite extreme with the SansAmp settings, what you'll find is that you can get quite a lot of crunchy tones out of it, like if we drive the preamp. Sometimes that low end crunch can get a bit out of control, a bit like oversaturating tape, quite crunchy and out of control. That sort of sound. That's a really cool addition to a drum sound as a means of tone shaping the kick and the snare. But as I say, the kick, the snare, and the saturation bus, I would send them all to the same place, and I wouldn't automate these throughout the mix necessarily. I might solo the saturation bus for a few bars for effect. But apart from that, once you've set up the phase relationships between the saturation bus and the snare and the kick, it's best to just leave it, because you're setting it up as a tone shaping device, and the minute you change the level of the send, you're actually adjusting what's cancelling out with the phase. You don't have to flip the polarity, but it's there as a tone shaping option should you need it. So where would I go from here? I'd probably add some light compression on the drum master. Now we're getting to a point where we've got a really cool drum sound, and all I've done is tone shape the kick a little bit to get it more pillowy, and adjusted the snare brightness and just some general EQ. I've put quite a lot of compression on the hi-hats and the overhead mono. And also feel free to play around with the amount that you're sending into that. If you don't like it, or you think you're getting too much snare but you like the tone, then you can just pull it down. Or maybe you want more of it. So there are a lot of tonal possibilities, and I encourage you to experiment. Also experiment with the filters. Also experiment with the slope of the filter. that's a great starting point for getting that Black Keys sort of sound, or Arctic Monkeys, that real crunchy, retro but modern sound. And it's a lot of fun. I have used this technique recently, which was on Nikki Rogalski's EP, and this technique was really a starting point for how I got that drum sound. So if you have any questions, let me know and I'll do my best to answer them all. Thank you for watching and enjoy using this technique and experimenting. Happy mixing, guys.